All right, title these notes, The Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties. Today, we will be talking about the period right after World War I. After the victory in Europe, a lot of things are going to happen in America at this time, and a lot of it has to deal with the prosperity, how we're going to deal with that prosperity after World War I, some good, some bad. The essential questions today, I want you to answer number one, what were some of the significant events that defined the Roaring Twenties, and describe them. Here are the other two that you can continue on. Now, our president, obviously, is President Woodrow Wilson. Okay, and here he is on the Princeton. He's commanding a naval boat. You can see the Germany with that's supposed to represent the subs, the Lusitania at the bottom. So he is going to be our president during this time period, as we know, through World War I. Now, some of the problems that we're going to see. The post-war economic slide, okay? And you can see this represented on this graph. And you can also see right here, we're starting to build up for World War II as well. But when we get back, when our troops start coming back, there's a big problem with some of the things that were made to build those war materials, the factories that, remember the WIB, which is basically a dictator for war, made those companies switch to producing war materials, and most of the companies made large profits off of that. But now they have to switch back. Now they have to go back to building domestic products. And for some companies, it was too difficult to do. There's now a huge surplus of goods that were wasted, and it creates a big problem. Okay, in all, war is good for business, and we can see that here represented in that graph. However, once the war is over and the government cancels their war contracts, there's no longer a demand for these goods and services. So you either have to go back to making what you did before or shut down. And unfortunately, a lot of companies just can't keep up. Production's down. There's not a big demand, so production goes down. When production goes down, there's not a big demand for workers either. And that becomes a bigger problem, as we're going to see in a second. Businesses suffer. Had to reconvert on their own back to civilian goods. And then what about the farmers? They were supplying wartime Europe with food. So they were overproducing for that. And now there's no more need for that. So what do you think is going to happen to their prices? Okay, so farm prices drop as competition increased. So all this created from World War I, from the process of basically being the arsenal for democracy, taking care of everybody else, all of our allies. And now the war's over, we have this surplus. Labor, unemployment rises, as I said, there's not a need for goods, so production and demand sinks, and the need for workers sinks as well. And this becomes a huge problem because now our veterans who either volunteered or were drafted went off to war to risk their lives for our country, and then they come back and they don't have jobs. That's a huge problem. And either they didn't have jobs, or some companies put those veterans into jobs and took other people out of them. So it's not really helping the situation either way. So unemployment is on the rise. We had over 4.5 million soldiers returning, and a lot of them wanted their old jobs back. So lots of problems. Strikes, wartime wage freezes are over. During World War I, most of the industries agreed not to go on strike. They agreed to a pay freeze during the war. Well, now that's over, and they want to get paid. So we start to see strikes pop up all over the place. One of the most famous ones is the Boston police strike. Okay, they go on strike because they haven't had a pay raise since World War I began. They had to buy their own uniforms. Their working conditions were very dangerous and harsh. The police commissioner refused to allow them to unionize with the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And 19 police officers were actually fired for union activity. And so they go on strike. So there wasn't a police force whatsoever. And Boston went crazy, rioting, looting, all over Boston. The governor of the time is future President Calvin Coolidge, and he actually gets a lot of recognition for this. Okay? He said, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anytime, anywhere." And basically, this makes him famous. Okay, basically says you can't, if you're a police officer and you're in charge of public safety, you've taken an oath to protect and serve, and by going on strike, you're not doing that. So they hired new cops, fired the old ones, and broke the strike. And like I said, Coolidge gets a lot of popularity for this. During the same time period, Prohibition, okay, the temperance movement, continued after the Civil War, all the way through World War I, and is growing more and more popular, with the women and kind of going on women's rights as well. The fight for Prohibition became a national fight through Christian groups as well. The Anti-Saloon League, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Prohibition Party. And states started passing laws cutting the manufacturing and sale of intoxicating liquor. In 1917, almost half the U.S. had gone dry. Dry means no liquor or booze. In 1919, the U.S. adopted the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of liquor through the U.S. Notice it doesn't say consumption, but how are you going to consume it if you can't buy it or make it? Enforcement became a problem, okay? And we start to see the moonshiners, and I'm sure you guys have seen some of those shows today, who will distill liquor illegally. Bootleggers who will buy and sell liquor from, they'll import it, especially from Canada. So you start to see some of these things, okay? Famous poem at the time: mothers in the kitchen washing out the jugs, sisters in the pantry bottling the suds, fathers in the cellar mixing up the hops, Johnny's on the front porch watching for the cops. It was a very common thing, okay? And a lot of you may have some past connections into some bootlegging during this time period with your family history. I know mine does. Some of the big-time mafia bosses really gained power during this time period. The most famous guy is Al Capone, okay? And as of 1929, Al Capone was making $60 million from liquor alone, $25 million from gambling, $10 million from prostitution, and $10 million from other places. He employed over 600 people. He was making over $105 million a year. Okay, he'll eventually be convicted of tax evasion. Okay, but one of the most famous things he was involved in, supposedly, was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, at 10 o'clock that morning in 1929, a car pulled up in front of a garage on North Clark Street in Chicago. 2 uniformed policemen and 2 plainclothesmen got out and went in the garage. Inside were 7 members of the Bugs Moraine gang waiting for the arrival of a shipment of booze from Canada. The 5 new arrivals frisked the 4, frisked the 7, then lined them up against the wall and took out their submachine guns and shotguns and opened fire. The 5 returned to their car and walking ahead of the other 3 with their hands in the air, acting like they arrested them. And they escaped. All of the 7 men inside the garage were killed. Okay, and that is called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. Presumably Al Capone was behind this because they were in a huge rivalry between themselves and the Bugs Moraine gang. This led to Eliot Ness and the Untouchables. Also led to much more crime during this. This is basically the height of the mafia, and it was caused because of Prohibition. Another guy, Lucky Luciano down here, he was the father, known as the father of the modern organized crime syndicate. Okay, he actually organizes them into basically a huge organization. Before it was just the rough guy on the end of the block. Lucky Luciano organizes them into Cosa Nostra, or the mafia of how we know it today. So, lots of problems during this time. The coal strike, UMW, the United Mine Workers. John L. Lewis is the leader of the UMW. Same thing. They had a non-strike agreement during the war, but after the war was over, the government said it was still in effect. So they called for a strike, wanted higher wages and a shorter work week. The Attorney General, Mitchell Palmer, got a court to order strikers back to work. Lewis calls off the strike in accordance to the law, but the miners refuse. They don't go back. So then President Wilson comes in and calls in for an arbitration board, and they partially settle it together. The workers will get a raise, but they will not be part of the... they won't get their shorter hours. The steel strike in 1919. Okay, once again, working conditions were rough here. 12-hour workdays, 7 days a week. There were over 300,000 steel workers during this time period. You can see the clusters in the areas. This is Pennsylvania. It's one of the major places there. They had trouble with management as far as wouldn't let them form a union as well. They had the strike would last almost 4 months. Okay, and finally, public opinion is what turns against them, and basically people don't feel sorry for them. Okay, and so that leads to the end of their strike. And the government doesn't step in this circumstance, and it leads to the end of their strike. Now, we talked about the Great Migration in the last unit. The over 500,000 African Americans moved to the north from the south to work in the factories during World War I. Unfortunately, the KKK, also known as the bigotry and bedsheets, will follow them. This is their highest point in history. They were against African Americans, Jewish, Catholic, foreigners, especially as well. And so we see a lot of problems, especially down south, but we're seeing it in the north as well because of the Great Migration. So another issue to deal with during the Roaring 20s. And that was one of their most famous symbols. They'd burn a cross in somebody's yard or on a property. Our foreign policy. Okay, we go back to isolationism. Okay, the policy of avoiding political or economic alliances with foreign countries. We reject the Treaty of Versailles. Remember, the whole part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany agreed to stop fighting because of Wilson's 14 points, and then the treaty doesn't follow any of those things, okay, except for one. Some of the senators feared being a part of the League of Nations would cause us to be entangled into Europe's affairs. Other senators felt that the membership would mean a loss of independence for the U.S., meaning we'd have to answer to other countries. So we decided to stay away, and we refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and we never joined the League of Nations, which killed Wilson, almost literally. Wilson campaigns hard for it and actually suffers a stroke And after the Senate rejects the treaty, okay, we'll actually sign our own peace treaties with Germany and then Austria and Hungary, which are now separated. Okay, the Red Scare. That's another issue. There's a huge fear of communism in America at this time, basically because of what happened to Russia. And we will stop at this point, and we'll pick up the lecture, part 2, with the Red Scare. So that is it. Make sure you do essential question number 1, and stay classy, Vandalia.